Welcome to the Raw Heart and Soul podcast. I am Tanya, and today with me, I have a very, very special guest. Normally I say I have special guests, but Paul is very special. Paul Taylor. And I've known Paul for about 15 years. He was around in the fitness industry when I first started as a PT with a very well-educated and influential group of guys. Some of those being Paul Check and Donald Carr and Michelle Dalcour. And I think I did some of your first workshops. I think the first one I did was at Filex, actually.
Oh, yeah.
A long time ago. But I've had some pressing questions I wanted to ask you along the way, which I haven't, which we're going to get into here later. And yes, you should be very worried. Very interesting. My first question, though, what was your driving factor behind studying neuroscience, and did that come after your time in the British Royal Navy?
So yes, it did come after my time in the armed forces. So I left the armed forces. I had already done a master's degree in exercise phys before I joined the forces. And then for my last couple of years when I was doing helicopter search and rescue, and there was a lot of free time, a lot of guys would sit and play videos. I wasn't really into that, video games. I did another master's in nutrition because I knew I wanted a completely separate career. So I came to Australia and I set up as an exercise physiologist and nutritionist in an office inside Craig Harper's personal studio, right? The awesome harps. And after a while, I realized that just telling people what to do and sharing all of this knowledge just wasn't enough. Some people got it, and lots of people, despite having a whole heap of knowledge, or me or others imparting all this knowledge, still weren't doing those things. And I thought, well, this is just, it's all about neuroscience. It's all about the brain. And so that's why I wanted to study that, to understand human behavior a little bit more, with a particular bent on how to actually influence it, or how to help people. So that was the why.
That was the why. That was the big why. When did you get into the Navy, and why did you go into the Navy?
So I joined the armed forces. I was quite late, actually, joining the armed forces. It was back in 1997. So I had gone to university, and while I was at university, I joined the officer cadets, which was an awesome way to just earn extra money and do something a little bit exciting. So I actually really got into that and thought, and I did my degree, and then I signed up to do a master's degree, and then thought, actually, I think I want to join the armed forces. So I actually applied to join the Royal Marines, the Royal Marine Commandos, and I got accepted as an officer. But there's only 2 batches. It was in May and September. And I got accepted after the cutoff. So it was the next year that my entry was in. It was May, and I turned 25 in June. So me and a mate of mine who also got accepted, we went traveling with a couple of others. So we had almost a year, we had 9 months. So we went traveling around the world, had a great time. And about 2 months before, I think I was still in Australia, or I might've been, I was a couple of months before I was in Australia, and our liaison officer wrote to me and said, I've screwed up. I forgot to put your forms in. I put Jason's in, but I didn't put yours in.
Gosh.
And he missed the cutoff date, which meant that I missed joining the May batch. And he said, look, you're into the September batch, but you've passed the age cutoff. So what that means is they will accept you unless they get more successful applicants than they have places. And then you'll be first out because of your age. And that's what actually happened. So about 3 weeks before, they said, you're not going to be a Royal Marine, mate. And
how did you feel about that?
Oh, I was absolutely gutted. I was gutted. I was pissed off at him because it was just this mistake, that it was an administration error. And my mate went off and joined the Royal Marines. So, you know, I was pretty crestfallen. But then he said, well, look, you know, the other option, you can join the Royal Navy as aircrew. You know, you have to go and do some aptitude tests. You've already passed for officer, but you can go and do your aptitude test. So I went and did that, and I just passed for pilot, but it was marginal. And I was pretty comfortable. My pass rate for navigator was called observer in those days. So I got that, and they told me, look, you can can actually, when you finish your flying training, you can go off and you can do all sorts of cool stuff, flying with Marines, or flying, doing some special forces stuff, all of that. So I thought, well, okay, that I'll go for that. So it was kind of by accident that I ended up as an aircrew officer in the Royal Navy, and it was due to an administrative error.
So you weren't a pilot, you were the sidekick,
I was
basically.
yeah. So they were called observers. In other countries, they call them tactical navigators. So the way that you say it is that the pilots fly the aircraft, we fight the aircraft. So we do all of the weapons and the tactics and stuff like that. And I ended up doing anti-submarine warfare, which is very, it's a Walter Mitty world where you're chasing hunting
Right.
submarines for a living. So I had to learn all about submarine tactics, all the stuff that Russian submarines would do, doing all. So it was pretty cool. It was really interesting. It was pretty fascinating. It was dangerous as well. And
Yeah.
then I ended up doing helicopter search and rescue in the mountains and islands of Scotland, which I think was probably the best job in the armed forces. It was this little outpost on the west coast of Scotland. It was just aircrew. And the flying was awesome. But I would probably explain it now as 60% 60% boredom, 20% excitement, and 20% terror.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because search and rescue by its very nature
Yep.
is dangerous shit. Right?
Absolutely. So when you say search and rescue of planes that have gone down, of your armed
So
services?
ostensibly we were military search and rescue, but if you look around the UK, the whole UK coastline is covered by different units. So some of them are military, some Royal Air Force, some Royal Navy, and some of them are civilian. But the military guys will do civilian. The vast majority of our jobs were civilians,
Right.
and lots of different things. People going up, climbing up mountains, whether they be English or or American tourists, thinking, "Oh, it's a lovely day. I'm going to climb this Scottish mountain," and then shit weather comes in,
Yeah.
and we have to go and pull them off a mountain, or people falling off a mountain, or people on the islands, pregnancies, heart attacks, and stabbings on a Friday night, glassings. There was a wide range of stuff, yachts, boats going missing, a whole gamut of things, of different search and rescue stuff. So it was very varied and pretty exciting, and a little bit scary at times.
What was your scariest experience?
It was probably, we got called out to a job and the Royal Air Force wouldn't go. It was really shitty weather. It was really low fog. And there was the pilot was very experienced. The two pilots were very experienced. I was reasonably experienced at that time. And the aircraft captain, a guy called Neil Armstrong, he said, "We'll do the job." It's not his real name. That's just his nickname.
Okay.
It's all nicknames in the military. But his surname was Armstrong, so his first name is clearly Neil.
Clearly, Neil.
So he said we would do it, and we actually flew out from Canada, I remember, and it was foggy, and we followed the road, and we would be flying visual with the road. And then all three, there was four in the cab, and one pilot was flying, the other three of us were on maps, and popping up over the electricity pylons, right, and pop up and pop down. So we did that, got to the side of the mountain, and opened the back door, and me and the air crewman are on harnesses hanging out the back door, basically conning the aircraft up the mountain because the pilots couldn't see anything.
Couldn't see the top
So
of the mountain with the
we're
fog.
visual, so we're just talking them up. And when you're conning an aircraft, there has to be constant talk. The sort of chat. It's 20 years ago now, so I can't really remember. But it's main rotor's tail, main rotor's clear, tail rotor's clear. Move up and right 2 meters, easy, steady. Move up 2 meters, main rotor's clear, and it's just this constant dribble. Every now and then they become visual, and they say visual, and then they take over, and then it goes into fog again, and they go lost visual, and then so we con the aircraft because we can hang out the back and see better than they can. So that job took hours, and I sweated more on that job than I've ever done. We had to go up, find somebody, get them off the mountain, come back down the same way, and then get back, and we had to do a refueling stop in the middle. But that was probably one of the scariest ones. The other scariest one was my first time on a ship. After we actually qualified, we went out and we were doing NATO war games in the North Atlantic, and a monster storm hit, and most of the ships went in. But I remember we went out flying, doing some anti-submarine stuff, and got a call to say the weather's too bad, you need to come back. So we came back and we pulled up alongside the ship, and I just pulled down my window so I could see it. The ship was on the left. I pulled down my window and couldn't see anything. And then the ship came woof way up into sight because of the waves. So I just looked out, and the wave had brought the ship down and us up relative to it. Thinking, where the hell's the ship? And then it just went right up, and it was going up. And I thought, screw this. I put the window back.
Close the window back, quick start. Yes.
Just closed my eyes. The pilots earned their money that day, I can tell you.
I bet.
Landing on a ship when it's all right, it's pretty hairy stuff.
What sort of condition were you find, like when you're going into situations like that helicopter one, you're rescuing somebody, do you have an understanding of what you're going, like you're trying to navigate the unknown of getting there, but do you know the condition of the person that you're going in to save? Like, what sort of skills are you trained paramedics in that situation? Like,
Yes. So I was a semi-trained paramedic, and the air crewman is a fully trained paramedic. Right. So we both have skills, but he's at that higher level. And sometimes you know, sometimes you don't know. So sometimes you say somebody's fallen off a mountain, you get no idea. I remember one job we went to, somebody had fallen off a mountain, and we got there. I lowered the air crewman down, and it was something called the Anakiga Ridge in Scotland, the south side. And the pilot, as we're going there, is going, she's dead. Nobody's ever survived to fall off the south side. But there were two people down there covered in blood, doing CPR on her. And so we had to go, and I had to winch them up. And turns out one was her brother, one was her fiance. And I had to, and they got into the back of the aircraft, and they just both broke down. So we went down. I had to drop them off at the police. So we did, and when we went back up, and the air crewman said, Cat 5, which means she's dead.
Gone.
But what had happened was her whole head bust open, her brains were out, almost every bone was broken. But when they scrambled down the cliff to find her, they were doing CPR, and there was wheezing coming out. So the air was coming out through holes, and
they thought she was alive, and she wasn't. Yeah.
And then when we pulled her up in the body bag, what we hadn't known is that the rest of her family, where there was like 13 of them, they were over for a wedding, her wedding, and they saw the body bag come up, so they went into shock. And then we had to go and rescue the rest, take the rest of the family off. And that was pretty hard that day. So, to answer your question, sometimes sometimes you don't know, and so you do a quick brief. We all know what the weather is like that day, because you got to be all on top of the weather. And then we do a quick brief if we have time, but often we have to be airborne within 2 or 3 minutes. So you go out and you just brief on the way. And so there's a lot of then just appraising the circumstances as you go. But that's what your training's for.
Wow. So
different world now. I'm a corporate speaker.
Different world now. And
people say to me, do you get nervous when you go on stage? And I say,
about what?
Try to kill me. It's like not going to fall off the mountain, or the helicopter's not going to crash.
No. Did you see? Were you in any of the? I'm trying to think of the time.
No, I didn't. I was in between Gulf Wars, and so I didn't. My frontline time was doing helicopter search and rescue. So I got the rub of the green, really.
So going into the army and training for all of that, and when you don't see action, how does that leave you? Like, do you feel unsatisfied that you haven't done a full job? Or
I think quite a lot of people are. But look, I really loved my time in the military, and doing the search and rescue, that you felt like you were doing something really frontline, that it is known as frontline time, and it's more rewarding than going to war. So I actually left, feeling pretty good that I'd ticked quite a lot of boxes. Whereas I know that, for instance, the mate of mine who joined the Marines when I was supposed to join the Marines, he didn't see any action. He says, there's a bit of emptiness in that you don't get to test your skills. That's what you train for. That's
right.
all about, right? And
Right.
it's a different mentality for civilians going, why the hell would you want to go and do that? But
I
that's what
think
all your
you've got to
training
have that.
is.
Yeah, you've got to have that kind of that level of not mentality. You've got to have that element or that seed to actually go into the army or whatever level you go in at. You've got
That's
to have
right.
that. Yeah.
I think that, and they have a very, very good process of weeding out people who aren't a good fit. And I just managed to get under the radar. But and then you know the whole sense of mateship, the whole sense of protecting and serving your country is very, 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 very strong. And so you know I do a lot of consulting with organizations and talk about the importance of purpose and of helping people to connect what they do on a daily basis to their overall purpose. And the military does that brilliantly.
Mm. That comes to a very good point. What do you think your sole purpose is?
Look, for me, I kind of identified mine, whether it's a sole purpose or for me, it's a pretty clearly defined purpose. And I like to use the analogy of what would you like to be written on your tombstone,
Yeah.
right? And I will run workshops with this and you know try to get it to 12 words or less, something that would sum up your life. And my purpose actually came out of a pretty shitty event where a number of mates of mine got killed in a helicopter crash that I could, other than somebody getting a medical discharge, there's a pretty good chance that I would have been in that helicopter. And you know, there was 8 people who died in that helicopter crash, and it didn't need to happen. But when mates really, and there was 2 really close mates of mine who died in that, and when close friends die, and particularly when you could well have been there, you start to think a little bit about your mortality. And you know, I'd read a lot of philosophy and stuff when I was younger, and I was traveling and stuff like that. And that's when I decided that you know I'm going to leave the military. I'm not going to extend. I was in a short career, and it was at that point: do you extend? Do you not? And I thought, you know what? I don't want anybody to be in control of my destiny, and I want to do something that is a little bit more worthwhile. And that's when I just started doing my master's in nutrition. I remember my secondary roles were always the sports officer or something like that. So
Right.
I decided to just put together a newsletter because I was an exercise physiologist studying a master's in nutrition on part-time. I started writing a newsletter. And I remember one of the crusty old chiefs came up to me and he said, that piece that you wrote, he said, that was awesome. That had a real impact on me and my family. And I thought, wow, that's fantastic getting that feedback. And I thought, this is what I want to do. So now, and it took me a while to sort of formulate it into that tombstone statement. But now my purpose is a military man turned educator to help others become better versions of themselves. And so for me, I'm pretty lucky in that I have that ikigai, what the Japanese refer to as ikigai. And so that sort of goes across my personal life and my professional life. So for me, in the personal life, it's about being the best father and the best husband that I can be to help my kids, my wife be the best versions of themselves, to help my friends if I possibly can, and then in a workplace, you know, going and helping people around peak performance, resilience, that sort of stuff. That's where I get my shits and giggles.
So you're in the corporate world.
I am.
You do mainly
Not currently, not that much currently. We're just coming out of lockdown now, so
we're all stepping back into it.
Yeah, but interestingly, you know, in March, I saw my business disappear in front of my eyes in about a period of about 10 days. But no, and the first lockdown, I thought it just everything went right. Everything got cancelled. And nobody was doing anything in the first lockdown because all businesses were just going, shit, how do we operate with people not in the office? You know, they were just really focused on business as normal. When Melbourne hit the second lockdown, I started getting a lot of calls from clients saying, we need to do something around resilience and mental health. You know, can we do something online? So I'm very familiar with Zoom these days. So yes, I am in the corporate world.
So you coach in groups. Do you coach any one-on-one or do you take one-on-one clients?
I do. Very little of that. I probably have two or three on the go, and normally they're very senior executives or CEOs of built big companies, and I do a pretty intensive coaching course all around being an executive athlete, but that's where I dip into stuff around meaning and purpose as well,
Yeah.
with these guys. So I don't take on very much, but I go pretty deep when I do it.
How would you measure, or do you have a measure yourself of when you're, and I'm going to use the term again, soul purpose, when you're fulfilling that soul purpose? Like, what's your gauge to know that you're living within that, and that you're, when you've got your clients, whether they be in the corporate world or whether they be the one-on-ones, how do you know that you're on the mark with what you're meant to be doing in this world?
For the individual you're talking about?
Yes, for you, like, how do you measure when you're living what your purpose is? Like, what's the feedback that you get from people, from clients, or from your life that tells you you are or whether you're not?
So for me, it is that feedback of that's really had an impact on me, or that's had an impact on my kids, or that sort of stuff. I tend to get quite a lot of that. People are very good with that feedback, and when it has a significant impact, when it hits them, in that heart area. And I'll often get that. And the thing that I love the most is saying, not only am I using these tools, but my kids, it's having an impact on my kids, right? That's when that's the sort of feedback that I love the most. But it is when I get that feedback that people have said, this has had a big impact on me. That's when I know that I'm living up to my purpose, because it's helping people become better versions of themselves. So for me, it's quite easy. My purpose is quite defined, and I'm in an area where I will often get that feedback from people around it, which becomes very gratifying.
What happens when you get the feedback that you've not, when you know that, I'm going to rephrase that. What happens when you get feedback that tells you haven't hit the mark? Say you've had a corporate group and you might not have felt it on the day that you've been presenting, but that you get feedback that you go, oh shit, I missed the mark on that.
Never happened.
Never.
No, I'm joking.
I'm like, where do I go next? Like, he's perfect.
Look, for me, I'm trying to think about negative. There's been one occasion, and it was actually in lockdown when it was supposed to be. We were supposed to do it face to face, and ended up doing it online. And there was a bit of higgledy-piggledy stuff, and they came back and said, that wasn't really quite what we were expecting. And I said, right, well, but let's do another one. Let's do another one when stuff opens up. So for me, if you're getting that feedback that you haven't hit the mark, it's about saying, well, okay, well, what do we need to do in order to make that hit the mark?
What about in your personal life? How do you know that when you're not living in balance with the things that you need to do to be a good human? Like, what feedback do you get in terms of your health and fitness or mental health that indicates that you're not where you should be, or where you need to be be best?
Yeah, look, from a mental health perspective, I think I've been pretty lucky. I haven't had any mental health issues in my life. The other people in my family have had mental health issues, so but I have been pretty lucky that I haven't struggled with that. But one of the key things that I noticed just around that whole physical side of things, one of my key values is about being authentic. And so if I'm going to stand up there and talk about peak performance, I need to be walking the talk. And for me, it's just about whether or not I'm in shape, is really the key thing. And I just use a very simple metric of some performance indicators. So I'll do regular stuff around beep tests just to know about my level. I do a fair bit of competitive sport, so I get feedback around that. And then I just use a very simple waist to height ratio, that if my waist goes above a certain amount, I go, right, you need to do a correction here.
Something's out of balance.
Something's out of balance. And often it's because I've had a shitload of travel going on, multiple states, over a couple of weeks, and the exercise has sort of dropped off, or, you're on the road all the time. and
food's not as good as it could be
food's
at
not as
home.
good. You're
Yeah.
doing social stuff with clients, and my Achilles heel is definitely alcohol, being Irish
Okay.
and ex-military, right? So
Yeah.
that's when I know, and I just have those early indicators that I go, right, you need to pull back, and you need to go hard. And I think part of that is the military thing. If you step out of line, there's a big correction. And so I'm quite hard on myself from that perspective. And I'll do a big correction once I hit a certain threshold.
Mm. Have you always been like that? Were you like that as a child? Or is that learned?
I think it's a little bit nature and a little bit nurture.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I was certainly a bit more sporty than my other two brothers. I had a bit more dog in me. On the soccer pitch, on the football field, I always had that. I was the one that put in the most effort, or certainly as much as others. So that's always kind of been with me. And I remember when I was at university, when we're training, doing training sessions with soccer, and I made the first team. It's pretty hard training, and the manager loved me because I used to train until I threw up, and then I used to go again. So I've had a little bit of that stuff in me, but then joining the military really helps to bring that out, or certainly did in me. And I remember when I was going through basic training, there were a bunch of guys that I kind of fell in with, that we would actually get up and we would do extra stuff. We'd get up in the morning and do log runs, or when it eased off
As
a
you
little
do.
bit, we'd do these log runs. And I remember we used to go down to the mud flats and do mud crawling and stuff like that. And it was
Just for the fun of it.
Yeah, just for shits and giggles. And there was 4 or 5 of us
God.
that kind of just pushed each other a little bit. So a lot of it is the company that you keep.
Yeah.
And just being in that military environment, but then falling in with a bunch of guys who were good eggs, and we just sort of pushed each other and bantered each other. I think that certainly helped, and it helped to build habits that just become a cornerstone of who you are.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier the word luck, and then just now you said that you fell in with. Do you believe that? Do you believe in luck, or do you believe in that happens, that you just fell in with those people? Or do you really, because I come from a perspective where I feel like the energy that we give out is what comes back. So it's not necessarily for me about luck. It's about putting yourself in positions where that luck becomes more available.
Yeah.
Putting yourself in positions where those people are, you attract those people to you.
Yeah, look, it's phraseology, really. I'm a big believer in that you do make your own luck, and it's about what you put out there. And actually, there's a British psychologist called Richard Wiseman, who's done heaps of research on this, and actually written a couple of really cool books about the luck factor and stuff like that. And he's done a whole heap of experiments, where he sent out in the UK, we're doing a study. We need volunteers. We need a bunch of people who think that they're really lucky, and a bunch of people who think that they're really unlucky, and did really cool psychological experiments on them, and find that actually lucky people aren't any luckier than unlucky people, and unlucky people aren't that unlucky. They just have a negativity bias in the brain. And so they miss the opportunities, or if they have an opportunity, because they have a negativity bias for whatever reason, and there's a whole host of reasons you can have it, that they don't think that it's going to work for them, so they don't take the opportunity. Whereas lucky people put themselves out more, and they actually take advantage of their opportunities, and they take risks, right? And so, if you're asking me to reflect on it, I would say that no, I wasn't really lucky. You make your own luck. And the people I fell in with, it's a gravitation to each other, and it's a reaching out. And actually, I had a really interesting conversation with Craig Harper recently, because both of us have managed to somehow get ourselves onto this. There's something called a Delphi panel, that's looking at cognitive fitness, and everybody. There's 50 researchers from around the world, all these really experienced professors, and then
smart people.
There's me and Craig Harper. We're talking to each other. And I said, yeah, and he's like, I'm on that too. And I was like, what the fuck? Well, how are we on this? Right?
And can we get a list of everyone else on it as well? Like what?
Yeah, we're both having to overcome our imposter syndrome, right? But look, I do believe that it is about what you put out there. I'm trying to teach my kids this as well, right? I think
Yeah.
it's really good life lessons for your kids, is to just notice the people who are other people who are attracted to, and they're generally very open, they're gregarious, they're friendly, they ask people about themselves, that sort of stuff. It's really good to have your kids notice these things and to coach your kids around these sorts of things.
So one of the things you just said there, you teach them, or you coach people to ask people about, like, not talk about themselves so much in a conversation. They ask about the other person. Is that what you mean? Why
Yeah.
is that?
Well, because we know that people who like people like people who like them, right? Dale
Mm-hmm.
Carnegie, a genius, way ahead of his time, 50, 60 years ago, wrote the book How to Win Friends, and Influence
Influence
People, right?
people. Yep.
Yeah, and it was like, I remember a line in that stuck in my head. People like people who like them, right? Who,
Right.
who ask questions about them, and it plays into motivational interviewing, which I'm a big fan of,
Mm-hmm.
which is about exploring people's their wants, their fears, and their apprehensions, their thoughts, those sorts of things. It's really about asking these questions. And so for me, for my kids, it's just notice people around you. You can learn stuff from every single person that you meet. You can learn awesome stuff from people who are super successful, and you go, rather than being jealous, say, well, what's good about them? What would I like to emulate about them? And then even the biggest dickhead on earth,
Mm,
they are learning opportunities. Is
absolutely.
like, so what do those people do that pisses me off and pisses other people off, right?
Yep. And
And
how can I not do that to other
how
people?
can I not do that? Yeah, how can I learn those lessons? I think is really the key thing.
That's awesome. How would you define spirituality?
So for me, spirituality is just about feeling that you are connected to something that's bigger than yourself. Um, and it's highly linked to so resilience is my wheelhouse.
Yep.
And there's a lot of research that shows that that religious people tend to be more resilient in times of trauma, and
Right.
because they are connected. Now, I am not religious. I'm a recovering Catholic,
I was going to talk to you about that.
from
I'm a
Northern Ireland.
recovering Catholic as well.
Yeah. So, and I don't particularly like that research, right? And I spent a bit of a time as an atheist, but now I'm kind of more agnostic, I would say. But then when you dig into the research, it turns out you don't need to be religious per se, and being spiritual, or actually having a sense of meaning and purpose in your life.
Right.
So for me, spirituality can be many things, right? It can be people who are into angels and all that horse shit, but I shouldn't say that. Or it can just be people who feel that they are connected to something that is bigger than themselves, for whatever that means, right?
Right.
So I have a pretty broad definition of spirituality.
And that ties into faith.
It can tie into faith, but I don't think it needs to exclusively be to do with faith. I think, and when you look at the research around human flourishing, and I have been a big fan of the Stoic philosophers,
Mm-hmm.
and that whole idea of service to others, and connection to others, and feeling that we are all part of something bigger. And for me, any spirituality that I have kind of comes from quantum physics, and we know that at a quantum level, everything is connected.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about energy, at that quantum level. And so for me, it is just about that deeper connection at an energetic level. And probably the most spiritual experience I had was 20 odd years ago in the jungles of the Amazon jungle, with a shaman, taking ayahuasca,
Right.
which is a very potent hallucinogenic brew in the Amazon,
Mhm.
but they have done it for thousands of years, and they call it the key to the underworld. And I've talked to a few people who have had similar experiences, and you do feel a profound sense of connectedness with nature and others at a level that is pretty unshakable.
When you say underworld, I would, and I haven't done ayahuasca. I've done other stuff,
Hmm.
but I would call it my inner world,
Mm.
not my underworld, or not the underworld. Would you agree, or would you disagree with that?
Yeah, look,
And
I think it's just about definitions, right?
right.
For me, that experience was actually more of a dissolution of self. So rather than inner, it's more from inside out, if that makes sense, and just understanding that we are connected to everything at an atomic level, right?
Mhm.
And you look at some theoretical physicists who have been atheists actually talk about that spirituality, and that the whole sort of Tao of physics, and that it's all about those energetic connections. And I'm getting a bit deep and wacky here, but
No, and that's where I wanted to go with this.
mm, so for me, it's more about, rather than going in deeper and deeper to the exclusion of the connectedness, it's more about that deeper self being fundamentally connected to others and nature around us,
Do you
if
think
that makes sense.
it does make sense? Do you think plant medicine is an avenue of disconnecting with the ego to be able to come into connection with everything that isn't the ego?
Look, the whole term about ego, these are all definitions, that are all constructs, right?
And labels we put on things to understand.
That's right. And
Yeah.
it's about us trying to make sense of the world. And
Mm.
so we use all sorts of false constructs and language to try to make sense of the world. A lot of it would just be, I would say it's just about having a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of things. So rather than you can go down the ego and that whole idea of identity being
Mm.
separate to others, and we can say, yes, it's a dissolution of ego. So if we want to use those terms, yes, it is a little bit about a dissolution of ego. And I spent quite a few years in my early years reading Carlos Castaneda and being fascinated. I actually started doing a master's degree in social anthropology
Oh, wow.
before, and I did a few months of it. I did a term of it, and then thought, you know what, I just actually want to go and experience it. So I went off traveling, and
Yeah.
so I ended up in the Amazon 20 odd years ago, when there was not a lot of people. There wasn't all this ayahuasca tourism that there was,
Right.
and me and this guy Giovanni, we did a 3-week trek deep into the Amazon jungle.
Mm.
And all we had was, we had a shaman, and we had 2 guides with us. And we were a couple of thousand Ks from the nearest road. And we went and visited these Matses Indians, and we did lots of different ceremonies, and it was a pretty cool, very, very raw experience.
Authentic.
Authentic, very authentic. We ended up doing sapo as well, which is
Yeah.
kind of frog poison, holes burnt into your arm and frog poison
Was
put in it.
put
It
into
was
you.
pretty full on.
What was more full on, the ayahuasca or the
Well,
supper?
the sapo was a much more full-on physical experience. The ayahuasca was a much more full-on mental and spiritual experience, for sure. But they were just both great experiences. And the thing for me about ayahuasca is that you look at the vine, the ayahuasca vine. It has to be combined with the chacuna leaf, right?
Mhm.
And in order to have that hallucinogenic experience. And I
Those
asked
two.
one of the shaman, because I was thinking about this, and you think about combinations and what we call the mass factorials, right?
Mhm.
And the chance of these guys finding that this vine and this
And
leaf combined,
in that jungle.
in that jungle where there are millions of plants, like the factorial chances, it's got to be billions to one.
Mm.
and so I said to the shaman, how do you guys know? How did you know how to do it? And they said, the plants talk to us. The plants are our teachers. So they, and this is, I think, is important for people to understand, is that our realities are very much defined by our upbringings, right?
Yep.
So I was brought up in Belfast, Catholic, Protestant, that sort of stuff. People brought up in the hill tribes of Pakistan have a very different view of reality, but there's still lots of overlaps with ours. But then you go deep into the Amazon jungle and the Matses Indians, they have a completely different view of reality. They believe that we are interconnected with all of the plants, right? That we are an essential part of an ecosystem that we cannot exist without, right? And so I think our upbringing has a huge influence, and people will recognize this from their listeners, particularly if they've had more extreme upbringings. And you have stuff that is pushed down your neck, whether you like it or not, or whether you're aware of it or not,
or whether there's a choice or not. Yeah.
And particularly, you listen to the Jesuits. Give me a boy at the age of 7 and I'll give you back a man at the age of 12, right? And something along those lines, right? But we know that the human brain, there is that great period of development of the human brain, and most of your development of the brain happens in your formative years. We're born with 200 billion neurons. By the time that we reach the age of 2 or 3, we've lost 100 billion through a process called synaptic pruning. So your experience actually shapes your brain, right?
Yeah. So if you don't use it, you lose it. So if you're not open and exposed to those experiences, then the brain, they're still there, but the brain drops them off because you're not using them.
Yeah, and it strengthens it. It's Hebbian learning. The Scottish neuroscientist Donald Hebb talks about Hebbian learning, nerve cells that fire together, wire together, right?
Yep.
And it's all about repetition. And who is it? There's a quantum physicist. He is professor of theoretical physics at Oregon University. Amit Goswami, and he's an Indian guy, obviously, with a name like that, but he's also a philosopher and a super sharp cookie. And he said that we do not perceive reality directly. We perceive reality through the mirror of memory, right? So if we think about what that means is, and the way that I communicate that to people is that everybody has a unique filter. We've got 7 billion different unique filters of how to view the world. And that's all to do with your experiences. So all of your experiences subtly influence your brain. And we know from neuroscience that it's the strong emotional experiences that have a disproportionate effect, because emotions encode memory. And particularly it's those experiences when you're younger that have a disproportionate effect on your brain, and then your brain/mind, which then is that filter through how you view the world and view different bits of information, right?
The brain goes back to that memory and holds on to it as it's like an anchor point of a reference.
Yeah, and exactly. It's a filter through how we perceive lots of different information, and most of it is subconscious. Most of the brain's processing is non-conscious. And so there are things that people don't even realize. We all have biases that we don't even realize that we have. And we all have filtering processes that sometimes we don't even realize that we have.
What can we do to try and, I know we're running out of time here, to try and wrap this up? What can the average person do to help not break down those filters, but see things perhaps through other people's perspective or through a different perspective to help improve their brain function?
Well, look, it depends on where they actually are right now. I think one thing is understanding that we have this filter. The second is a willingness to want to continually adapt, right? And so we know that there is a huge amount of neuroplasticity in the brain. So one thing that I always say to people, and I do this right now. So I'm watching the US election. I'm not a particular fan of Donald Trump, right? And I watch a bit of CNN, but then I always make sure that I jump onto Fox News to see the other viewpoint, right? And I think this is really important for people, is to not just surround you. A lot of people surround themselves by people who are like them. And that's okay. It makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel safe. but it can be quite limiting. And so there's lots of confirmation biases that go on. So for me, just exploring other worlds, exploring other ways of viewing things with an open mind to understand that we have a very, very strong confirmation bias, which means that we tend to seek out information that agrees with our worldview
Yeah.
and minimize or dismiss information that disagrees. So
And we want to be right.
yeah, that's right. That's right. And your brain's a predictive machine, right? So it
Right.
makes predictions all the time and it likes to be right. So it tends to then gravitate towards it. Now, and then this is part of the scientific method, is that you should be exploring all possibilities, not looking for a predetermined truth, but to actually say, well, is there any validity in this? Is there any validity in that? I mean, when you discount it all, then you can say with a certain amount of probability that we think this is right. So for me, it's taking that scientific method into your everyday life to actually look around and say, well, let me challenge some of these things. Let me surround myself with people who think a little bit differently and try to put myself in their shoes. Let me read different bits of philosophy. If I adhere to a particular religion, let me read other types of religion and try to, as Gandhi said, don't judge people until you've walked a mile in their shoes.
Right.
So for me, it's about surrounding yourself with novel experiences and novel people, because that's what drives neuroplasticity, is that novelty.
Do you think empathy drives it as well?
Oh yeah, huge. I mean, empathy's got a huge impact on how we actually process that information. So if we have empathy with an individual, we are going to be much more likely to see their viewpoint, to actually look at things a little bit differently. So I think empathy is hugely important in all of this.
I grew up a Catholic, in a very strong Catholic family, particularly my extended family. So for me, practicing this, I started doing this at the beginning of isolation. I think it was January when the book came out, but I read a book called You Can't Say You Didn't Know by Sophie McNeill.
Okay.
She's a journalist, an Australian journalist who spent a lot of time in war zones, but particularly in the Middle East. And for me, looking at or reading her book was traumatic and devastating, because I had to then question what I had, and I've done this before, becoming a recovering Catholic, but trying to understand why people are at war and why they are fighting, and putting myself in a position where I have to acknowledge that I'm a part of that because I'm part of this world, and my ignorance to that, and me just saying I can't understand it, so I don't want to know about it, has been my downfall. And that's hard to admit because I have to think about the different ways of thinking of things, and having empathy for people on both sides of that, even the people who are what I deem to be doing horrific things. And even looking at Donald Trump, I don't agree with what he's doing, but he's there for a reason, and he's come into our consciousness for a reason. We've brought him there as a whole. My perspective or my opinion is we've brought him there as an unconscious collective for a reason, whether we hate him or love him. So understanding the elements of people that we don't love, and then trying to have empathy for those people, not in a way that I have sympathy and I'm trying to feel sorry for them, but having an empathy and understanding where they've come from and why they are the way they are.
Yeah, and I think it's a hugely important thing for people to get their head around, and what most people need to understand. So let's take either Catholic, Protestant, whatever it may be, the ardent ones. If you were brought up in the Hill tribe in Pakistan, you would not have been a Catholic, right?
Right.
Simple as that, right? So we are a product of our environment and an indoctrination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you look at those sorts of suicide bombers, it's very easy to go, they're just evil people. And they're not evil people. When you look at it, the stuff that drives people to be a suicide bomber is lack of hope. It's lack of opportunity and lack of hope, and lack of relatedness, right? So I had done a podcast recently with Richard Ryan, who studied serial killers and found that every single one of them had their basic needs violated as a kid. And
Right.
the biggest one was relatedness, of not feeling that you are part of a group or have a say, have a voice, right? But he talked about autonomy, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So a lot of those people in the Middle East are brought up in really harsh environments, where actually, when you look at it, lots of different countries have done pretty horrible things
To each
historically.
other. Yeah.
And
And
historically,
when you open that door, you can see that.
and there's an awesome book that everybody should read called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Okay.
To just look at some of the stuff that the US have actually done, and it's not just the US. Britain was pretty horrendous back in those days. But there are, when people are brought up in an environment, you look at the Palestinians, and I spent a bit of time on a kibbutz in Israel, and have a lot of empathy for both sides actually over there. But when you're brought up in Palestine, and there's no opportunity, there is no hope, and particularly those teenage boys who have all of these dopaminergic neurons developing, wanting a sense of identity, and then these people come on and they give them a sense of identity, they give them a tribe,
The connectedness
to connect with,
Yep.
and then they preach to them, and these guys aren't uneducated. I mean, the Stoics talked about one of the key virtues being wisdom, which is really about knowing, having the sense about who you should listen to. So a lot of those guys are victims of their circumstance, victims of lack of opportunity, and a lack of wisdom, and then being prone to ideological people, right?
Right.
And they think that they are good, right? And if we were in their shoes, we would be thinking that we are doing good, right? But
Yeah.
unless you understand the whole history of the Middle East, and the whole history of how these people, their lives, unless you go and live their lives, you really cannot judge. And it's the easiest thing to judge. And I think the media has got a lot to answer for in all of this stuff.
Yeah. But as consumers of the media, we have to be more aware of that. And like you said, that point, coming back to it, choose where you choose, not choose, but get different perspectives from different media outlets, and
get different perspectives.
Get outside that echo chamber.
I'd encourage, yeah, exactly. It's about the echo chambers, right? That's the
Right.
key thing. I'd encourage every one of your listeners to get onto CNN and then jump on Fox News, or vice versa. And it's like it's two different worlds.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely different perspectives.
Yeah, for sure.
I have one last question for you. I promise this is the last one. And it's completely aside from everything that we've talked about. And it's the one that's been burning me for years.
Yes.
Why? I consider you a very smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you put yourself in sports, combat sports, in boxing, and I can understand jiu-jitsu, because I understand that a little bit more in recent years, because my son did jiu-jitsu for a little while and Donald's a big believer in it. But why do you put yourself in positions where you beat your brain up?
It's a really good question. It's been asked lots of different times, right? If it's any solace to you, I'm now retired from boxing.
Okay.
But I think people who ask that question, it's really hard to explain to them. There is something primal about combat sports, and it's more, I think it leans itself more to males than females. So it's not exclusively, but it does lean more to males than females. I remember one of my early fights. I was standing with a guy that I was about to fight before he came on. He was doing I don't know if you've ever seen the way monkeys or gorillas, they do that with their jaw.
Yeah.
And he was reflexively doing that. And I was looking at him going, geez, he's wired. And he just looked at me and he said, I've never felt more alive than I do right now.
Very primal.
And it's primal, and it is the epitome of flow state. So when I did my one and only professional boxing bout, when the bell rang, and there was a whole heap of people in there, right, mostly drunk, and there was a cacophony of noise. When the bell rang, my whole perception massively changed. It was just like zoom, tunnel vision, and I couldn't hear the noise, right? And it was just that is the one and only time, or one of few, probably when I was in a car crash as well, where everything, an altered state, an absolute altered state, and for me it was the epitome of flow state. but it's just in that combat thing. You can't walk away. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm a bit tired." No, I think I'll just stop. So for people who have never experienced it, it's a really hard thing to explain. But you get a bit of a taste for it, and it does become a little bit addictive, and it's about just being in that state where you are more alive than you've ever been,
Yeah.
and your wits absolutely have to be about you, and you're pushing yourself physically and mentally beyond a place where you've ever been. But yeah, it's bad for your brain, right? And
Right.
I
Logically, it's bad for your brain.
yeah, yes, it's very bad for your
But
brain.
it goes beyond that. From what you're describing, it seems like it's a very physiological, like fully encompassing, like
it, it,
mental.
it is a level of experience that most people do not get to experience. It is the way that I would put it. And look, we always rationalize things to ourselves, but I said, I'm only going to do one professional. I had five fights in total, and quite a bit of sparring. And I thought, well, look, I know, for example, I know that I don't have the APOE E4LL, because when people do that, any sort of contact sports with their head, and they've got that's bad juju. So I'm an E3 from that
Right.
perspective. However, I still know that it is a risk. But when you look now, AFL, friggin' horrible for the brain,
I was going to
horrible.
say, so you would put that in that same category?
Rugby, horrible for the brain. Boxing is more obvious, right?
Right.
It's much more obvious, but it's really about, and look, any hits to the head are bad, but it's particularly concussion, and then coming back, and when the brain is inflamed from concussion and you get hit again, and that's when a lot of brain damage occurs. And so we're now starting to see, and I'm a bit concerned about soccer because I played soccer for 40. I still play, and I head the ball a lot, either center midfielder or center half. And there's research coming out now that's actually really bad for your brain. And lots of those contact sports are so bad for our brains, and AFL is just, it's pretty horrendous for the brain, as is rugby union, rugby league, American football, where they got a helmet as a weapon.
I was going to say, I think that's worse.
It's probably the worst, and because using it as a weapon.
And because they've got a false sense of security that's going to protect my head, and
well, they actually lead with the head, right? And so
stupid.
and we're seeing all this come out, but we are going to see more and more coming out about different combat sport, or sorry, I said other sports, not just boxing, because I think people get that, but AFL, rugby union, rugby league, even soccer, anything that involves that head stuff. But it's particularly when there's been concussion, and having several bouts of concussion is really bad juju. So, but what I do everything else to mediate for that, right?
Here's you quantifying the risk factor versus what you do in preparation and post.
Well, that's right. Exactly. But I know that my brain would certainly be better off without having done any of that. But I also know that my overall health would be better off, and my bank balance would be a shitload better off if I never drank any alcohol. But it's all about risk versus reward, right?
And balance.
And balance, and people have got to make their own judgments, right? If we take that to the extreme, we know that people who reduce their calories below what you need by about 30%, will live longer. I mean, all the studies show every single species, primates as well, live longer on significant long-term calorie reduction. And actually, there's been some studies with humans showing that's probably the case. But you will be a miserable bastard.
Yeah.
You will have frig all sex drive, and you will probably be depressed, and life will just be
quality
shit, right?
Not quality, right? It's quality versus
and so everybody's got to make their own judgments, right? And had I known then what I knew now, would I still do it? Maybe, maybe not. But when you're younger, you take more risks, particularly when you're younger and you're male and you're full of testosterone. You take more risks, right? And you learn a little bit as you get older. But for me, it's then about, what's the risk mitigation strategy?
I think too, when you're younger, not your risk factor, but your body's a little bit more cushioned because you're not losing those fluids as rapidly, like not being able, as we grow older, our ability to replenish the fluids in our brain and in our synovial fluid and our joints, and our disc spaces reduces. So when you're younger, you've still got a risk, but I think that risk is less than as you get older, because your recovery is much longer.
Yeah, you know, this whole thing, decay is an inevitable part of being alive.
Right.
It's inevitable. It's just it's a basic law of physics. And so as we age, our ability to repair ourselves from damage becomes diminished. And what people need to understand, just by being alive, you create damage. You create cellular damage just by breathing and digesting, right?
And by thinking, emotional damage.
Yeah. And look, absolutely. And you know, we could speak for half an hour about the impacts of psychological stress, the physiological impacts, right? And so for me, I look at it and go, well, actually, I from a mental perspective, I don't do a lot of negative rumination and stuff like that. People who do probably are doing their bodies and brains more damage than I have.
Than the actual act of doing it. Yes, correct. Because they're worrying about it.
Yeah, that's right. But just being alive is bad for your health, right? Over time, it's a fundamental truth.
Right.
And so it is understanding that, yes, when you're younger, you do get away with more. As you get older, you know, and particularly blokes who hit my age and think, oh yeah, females are the only ones who get menopause. Horseshit. Look up andropause. Yeah. It's real, right?
Totally. Yep.
And so you have to work harder when you get older. You have to be a little bit stricter if you want to enhance your health span.
And reserve what you've got for a longer period of time.
That's right. But then who wants to be 100 if you spend the last 15 years living in a wheelchair and the last 5 years in a vegetative state?
And being a miserable shit because you're trying to save all of that for the end anyway.
And have a shit life. So I think it's quite liberating not being religious, because I just go, Jesus, there's one go. We get one tilt at this bad boy. So we got to live life to the fullest within those limits, right?
Those paradigms, yeah.
Exactly. You got to live life to the fullest, but try to increase your health span as you do that. So it all becomes a trade-off.
Sure does. Thank you very much for being with me today, Paul. This has been good. And like I said, we could go on for hours, and I might ask you to come back for my next season if that's okay. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.